Lecture 48, Blaise Pascal.
The subject of this last lecture on the literature of the Renaissance is Blaise Pascal, born in 1623, dies in 1662. The very shortness of the life of Pascal encourages, I think, to make a couple of initial points. First is that he was a prodigy who accomplished an enormous amount in the relatively short time that he was alive. He's claimed as an important figure by scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, as well as literary scholars. And although we will be looking at the two literary works that have remained canonical in the French tradition, the Pensées and a polemical work called the Provincial Letters, it's worthwhile to say something about these other concerns because there are interesting connections between all of Pascal's work. The other initial point that I would like to make is that his most important work, the Pensées, Thoughts, was left incomplete at his death, and what we have are a series of fragmentary notes, the very form of which and their relationship to a proposed finished product has been a matter of a great deal of debate. There are some very interesting examples in his early life of his talents. He was educated by his father, who was also a mathematician, but who insisted that he learn Latin and Greek before he could turn to math. So young Blaise's form of rebellion was to respond by teaching himself geometry, so that by the age of 12, he was able to demonstrate the first 32 propositions of Euclid. And in fact, his first work was a work on math on conic sections, written when he was 17 in 1640. His father was, among other things, a tax collector, and that involved a lot of complicated work with sums and so on. He invented a kind of calculator to help his father. In another work, he attempted to refute, and successfully refuted, a view that goes back to Aristotle to the effect that nature abhors a vacuum. And in fact, his work in this area was important in the development of the barometer. In 1646, he came in contact with religious thinkers who have come to be known as the Jansenists. His father took a fall and needed sort of permanent around-the-clock care, and the two folks who came to care for his father were themselves followers of the Dutch thinker Jansenius, who turned out to be a controversial and influential religious figure. His sort of coming to see these folks, among other things, made him a much more serious and conscientious Catholic Christian. Jansenius, or Jansen in English, can be seen best, I think, as a kind of serious, rigorous interpreter of the thought of St. Augustine, especially Augustine's teaching on matters of grace and free will. And in fact, Jansenius's work on Augustine is a pretty good historical study of Augustine, as well as a rigorous teaching in its own right. Now, in 1651, he came to Paris for medical treatment. He had chronic headaches and stomach pains, and in fact throughout his life. And while he was in Paris attending to these things, he seems to have suspended his religious interests somewhat, and his interests tended to be more toward hanging with the Parisian socialites, and especially those who were at the upper end of the food chain. They tended to be both free-thinking in their philosophical views, very, very skeptical, professionally skeptical, and libertine in their ways. It's hard to think of Pascal as a party animal in any way, but it seems that for a time he was at least traveling, he was a fellow traveler perhaps with party animals. The importance of this, I think, is both that it speaks to his first conversion and to one coming up. There's sort of a, get God, lose God for a while, get God again. But also because the unfinished fragment, the Pensée, was conceived not simply as a kind of apology for the truths of Christianity. It was aimed particularly at the skeptical and upper-class society in France that he had himself a good deal of personal contact with. Another, more permanent conversion came in 1654, so profound that he determined to devote himself only to religious activities from that point on. He presents himself as having had a direct experience with the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and the God of Jesus. And from that point on, despite poor health, indeed one could say failing health, and despite the fact that he had other concerns of an intellectual nature, he spent time praying, reading the Bible, helping the poor, so that he was somebody who took this conversion very seriously in terms of its effect on his life. These are the main formative influences, and because of his closeness to the Jansenist sect, if that's the right word, the Jansenist way of looking at Catholic Christianity, he wrote in 1656 and 1657 a work that has come to be called the Provincial Letters. It turns out to be a defense of the Jansenist position. The theological issue, at least from the Jansenist position, from the Jansenist point of view, was that they took the offensive and attacked what they saw as a kind of laxity that had developed in certain church quarters, which was almost a kind of reaction to the Catholic Counter-Reformation. You'll recall that in a previous lecture we had talked about the rigors of the Counter-Reformation. Well, in a sense, we're far enough away from that now that there is a kind of, let's relax from all of that. Let's not get carried away by this stuff. Well, this moral laxity was something that was appalling to the Jansenists, which they found primarily among the Jesuits, a powerful religious order that was itself originally founded as a kind of arm, or given approval perhaps, as an arm of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So the debate began earlier, before Pascal had a part in it, because there was an earlier apology on the part of somebody who was an important spokesman within the Jansenist community. In 1643, a debate began with a publication of a work on the reception of frequent communion by a Jansenist named Antoine Arnaud. Arnaud wrote an account of two worldly people who wanted to sort of receive the sacrament of confession. Two worldly penitents, one going to a Jansenist confessor and one going to a Jesuit confessor. Well, what's of course involved in all of this is this sort of attack on laxity, but it deals with some heavy theological issues. What is the relationship between what the sacrament provides according to its own power and the state of soul, or the state of heart, perhaps, of the penitent himself before or after the reception of the sacrament? It seems as though, in this account at any rate, the Jesuit, who, by the way, is given a name, it's not as though this is some anonymous Jesuit out here. It named a real Jesuit from a real Jesuit community, seems to endorse a very lax notion of contrition. The theological justification, such as it is that the grace comes from the power of the sacrament, not from the state of soul of the person receiving it. So it seems to be saying in this Jansenist account, so you're not really sorry. So this idea of amending your ways, you kind of mean it. That's good enough. And this was what was really attacked. In other words, the Jesuit seems to be saying that a lack of true contrition by the penitent isn't that big a deal. Well, a couple things are at issue here in terms of the larger problem. One is that you had essentially an arcane theological debate, a debate that, those folks who want to sit around and argue what Augustine really means, they're welcome to it, but don't count me in there. But all of a sudden, because names were named, it became public. And the public turns out to be interested not because of the niceties or not because of the technicalities of the theological argument. The public became interested because it had a lot to do with the way in which folks really were going to lead their life in society. In other words, the perennial question for Christians is, how do you integrate your Christian beliefs in society? When you're a member of society, how do you live as a Christian? So I think that's why the public was interested, and the Jesuits, who saw themselves insulted, and rightly so, did what they had often done in a situation like that. They used their political clout, which in this case means taking their position to the Pope. Not going to mess around. And what the Pope did was he condemned 5 propositions on the nature of grace, which the Jesuits claimed came from the work of Jansen. Arnaud, no political novice himself, comes back with an agreement. He says, yes, I too think that those 5 propositions are wrong. I agree with the condemnation. However, these are not propositions that you can find in the work of Jansen. And he said that he agreed with whatever Augustine said on the matter of grace. Well, this didn't solve the issue at all. No less an authority than the confessor for the king, who at this time, of course, was Louis XIV, said that the Jansenist position was not really following Augustine, rather that it was embracing Calvinism instead. So at that point, Pascal was called in to be the big gun, so to speak, for the Jansenist position. And what enabled him to do this, or perhaps better, one of the reasons why they wanted him, the Jansenists, to be their spokesperson, was that they saw that one of his singular talents was to make a highly specialized debate not only accessible, but also extremely interesting to a wide audience. 18 letters appeared serially and anonymously in 1656 and 1657. Letter 1 turns out to be a great success, and so letter 2 takes this idea of having a kind of naive narrator who just sort of tells about what the Jesuit position is and reduces it to a kind of absurdity. Letter 3 becomes a defense of the Jansenist apologist Arnaud, and Pascal begins to sort of see himself on a roll, which is to say what? Which is to say he begins to challenge the moral authority of those who are attacking the Jansenists. In books 5 through 8, for example, he shows that the Jesuits, in his reading of their position, would have to endorse simony, the buying and selling of church offices, as we saw in another lecture, usury, murder, and adultery, to name only a couple of the biggies, and used rather brilliant rhetorical strategies to underscore the difference between the Jesuits and what he saw as revealed truth. He pushes the position to the point where what he says is that the kind of religious subjectivism that the Jesuits position entails really turns out to suggest that the institutional or organized church isn't really necessary. That is to say, that the sacraments themselves are not really necessary. And he says that what's sort of interesting is that if you wanted to follow the Jesuits, they don't really put any demands on you whatsoever. You could lead pretty much any kind of life that you wanted and still call yourself a good Christian according to the norms that they were developing. And he goes on to say, and in fact, if we're trying to talk about what the position of a Christian ought to be inside civil society, in point of fact, what the Jesuits demanded of somebody was much less than what they needed to be a citizen inside civil society. Well, the Jesuits, needless to say, wrote responses to this, which further provoked letters from Pascal. He accuses the Jesuits of misusing their sources, and that turns to a discussion of what is in some ways the guts of the provincial letters, a discussion of the way in which language can and ought to be used. In other words, what are the different ways of using language as an instrument for finding out truth, which is one of the big issues in Pascal's thought taken as a whole. Letter 17 goes so far as to accuse the Jesuits of fabricating the whole Jansenist heresy to undermine the fact that they were a threat, the Jansenists, to their own, the Jesuits, political hegemony, so that it's really more about politics than it is about religion. Now, after Pascal, the debate continues, not really worth getting into here, but from a literary point of view, the provincial letters are really an important document in the history of satire and rhetoric in Europe. As a satire, it continues, as a matter of fact, to have an honored place in European literature. Particularly impressive is what Pascal has to say in letter 11 about the differences between a language of force, that is to say, a language that is meant to browbeat you into agreeing with it, and a language of truth. He's giving an important lesson, I think, in what kind of rhetoric is appropriate for theological disputation. And it seems to me that it's within that context that we can see this as a work that has enduring value, along with the kind of wit and along with the kind of grace of Pascal's writing. The Pensées, his most important work, much more difficult to get a handle on. 1,000 notes of varying length. How is one to interpret them, since they're only a fragment of what Pascal wanted to complete? What he seems to have done is kept notations on a series of, I guess we think of as large pieces of paper, but then cut them up into smaller sections and arranged them. And one question that has troubled scholars from his time to the present is, should we keep them in the order that they were found? This in itself is problematic because, of course, we're not sure whether this was sort of a temporary expedient thing or whether this really did represent some sort of thing that Pascal said, no, this is the way it should be done. Some scholars say, just think about this as a work in progress. That's the best that we can do. Or should we order them according to subject matter based on what Pascal intended to do? We know something, though not all we would like to know, about his intentions. Stuff that he was interested in this time, from 1656 through 1658, he was reflecting on the truths of the Bible and also on the kind of evidence that miracles might be able to provide. And we also know that he was talking about this. The center of Jansenism in France was a convent named Port Royal. It was originally for sisters of a particular order, of Cistercian nuns, but then later they sort of became independent, and it was sort of a place that was the center of Jansenist thought. He gave a kind of lecture there, a talk on an overall plan for developing a Christian apologetic. And so we know something about what he was thinking because of that. And we know that he was thinking about the audience, as we've already mentioned, the idea of trying to make Christianity seem not only true, but making it seem somehow appealing to folks who had no use for it, the folks, as I said, who were at the top of the social and political food chain in France at this time. So basically what we have are notes toward this longer project that Pascal does not live to complete. And it really does present a problem for the modern reader who wants to go through and read them in some kind of order, as one could do, let's say, for example, in the World Classics here, or in the Penguin version, both of which I think are good modern English editions of the Pensées. The first part, at least in terms of the way it's usually ordered, is often called the quote-unquote anthropological part, which is to say, it's a part that has sort of insights about the human condition from a general perspective, stuff that doesn't necessarily talk about ideas of Christian truth, but which sort of leads to why one should begin to discuss this. In other words, it's all about what it is in the human condition that forces us to take life very seriously. And so you have a number of thoughts on these things, but it's very difficult for somebody coming to a reading of this cold. At first, it looks like you're reading a book of Proverbs, and they don't seem, therefore, to be necessarily connected to each other. But the more one reads, the more one sees that there are connections there, and yet it's left up to the reader to find them. And needless to say, people have found various ways of making those connections. But he thinks about what it's like to be human, having a nature that stretches up to the infinity that's above us and the infinity that is below us, that we stretch up to infinite space, and also in the other direction, things disappear into unimaginable smallness. It's his style, really, that gets us to contemplate what that might mean. He thinks about being with prisoners in a dungeon waiting for execution and using that as a kind of meditation on what it means, really, to be human, because we are all under a sentence of death, and talks about the fact that there are an awful lot of people who spend their life trying to avoid that problem and avoid that issue. He famously talks about humans as being thinking reeds. In all of this, he sees humans as seekers and gets particularly indignant at those who either refuse to face these realities or those who find poor substitutes for facing these realities. He's also very good at dealing not only with ideas, but also with psychological states. It wouldn't be a bad idea just to simply go through and read Pensée after Pensée, but what I want to do is to limit myself to two of them that I think are interesting in terms of a kind of insight into the way his mind works. Pensée number 72 in this edition: too much and too little wine. If you give someone none, he cannot discover the truth. It is the same if you give him too much. Well, it seems to me that there's a lot more there than initially meets the eye, one of which is that sense of humans having to know their place in the cosmos. Over and over and over again, Pascal comes back to that, and we mess up by too little or by too much. But it's also interesting to sort of situate this, and I found that particularly interesting in the light of what we said previously about, let's say, Rabelais. Rabelais would, if he were writing this, would say, can't do anything without wine. There's no such thing as too much. And so it almost is though Pascal is in dialogue with some of his predecessors, and sometimes he actually does name them. There are a couple of places, very interesting, where he talks about others of the folks that we've seen, for example, in these lectures, Montaigne in particular. He seems not to have had all that much use for Montaigne, and I think it's interesting to compare them. Another one of the famous Pensées, which I think is worth taking a look at, is the one where he talks about diversion. What are all of the things that kind of occupy us? Well, he says here, on the occasions, This is number 168 in the Oxford Classics version. On the occasions when I have pondered over men's various activities, the dangers and worries they are exposed to at court or at war, from which so many quarrels, passions, risky, often ill-conceived actions, and so on are born, I have often said that man's unhappiness springs from one thing alone: his incapacity to stay quietly in one room. If a man had enough to live on, and if he knew how to stay happily at home, then he would not leave to go to sea or besiege a town. You only buy a commission in the army, which is so expensive, if you cannot bear being unable to leave town. You only go out of your way to find conversation or card games if you cannot remain happily at home. Well, one way to get another sense, a deeper sense of what the Pensées are all about, is to take a look at number 680 in this World Classics edition. It's about the most famous, it is the most famous of the fragments, the so-called Pascalian wager. And again, just to read a little bit of that and then to talk about its implications. It's basically wagering on the existence of God. Let us therefore examine this point and say, God is or is not. But toward which side will we lean? Reason cannot decide anything. There is an infinite chaos separating us. At the far end of this infinite distance, a game is being played, and the coin will come down heads or tails. How will you wager? Reason cannot make you choose one way or the other. Reason cannot make you defend either of these two choices. Well, in its essence, this seems to be betting on God, and an awful lot of ink has been spilled about what Pascal is really getting at here. Betting on God, of course, if you win everything. The possibility of eternal life if God in fact exists. If you lose, Pascal is saying, you lose nothing because it would have come out that way anyhow had you bet against him. Well, one way in which people have read this is to mean that you read this, since the evidence can go either way, you read this to mean you place your bet on the option with the highest expected value. Okay? Got nothing to lose and you've got everything to gain. Now, to a lot of people, this has seemed, and I think read this way, rightly so, as very crass. Okay? That this seems like way, way, way too serious an issue to just simply flip a coin over, even though you know how the coin is going to come out in advance. And it seems like, in addition to that, what you're doing is not allowing for a serious examination of the evidence that does exist one way or another. Oh, what the heck, just flip a coin, and the coin's going to come out heads. Act as though God really does exist. So it seems to me that looked at from that perspective, there's something not very appealing about it, to say the least. But I think what Pascal is getting at is something far more profound and part of an overall strategy. So rather than just looking at it that way in terms of a kind of theological and philosophical vacuum, let me just say the following briefly. One, Pascal certainly believed that Christian theism is true, and he thought that there was lots of evidence in this regard for the fair, unbiased observer. But Pascal also knew that very few of us are fair and unbiased. Who we are affects what we see. Or to put it another way, Pascal is very profound in other places in the Pensées, talking about the fact that in human life, reason doesn't always call the shots. We see what we want to see and don't see what we don't want to see. Pascal has a long list of what counts as evidence, but he thinks that if we make this bet, and after all, we have to anyhow, none of us is allowed to stay home from the casino on this one, because the way we lead our lives is going to tell us one way or another which way we're betting. What he's saying is that the kind of life that we lead is in fact what's going to help us see the evidence more clearly. So that if we, quote unquote, bet on God, we will be more likely to see the truth. Betting on God, in other words, according to Pascal, puts us in a much better position to see the evidence, to have the intimate experience of religion, such as, of course, Pascal himself claims to have had, that is more direct than even the best evidence can provide. Pascal continues to fascinate and delight, to provoke and inspire, and even to enrage. There's something unique about the combination.